The night air in Kiev carried a chill that seeped into the bones, but inside the old boxing gym, heat radiated from the sweat-soaked canvas. The rhythmic sound of fists colliding with leather echoed through the space, a familiar symphony of war. Oleksandr Usyk moved like a ghost, his footwork a dance refined through years of battle, his breath steady, controlled. He had been here before on the precipice of something monumental, standing at the edge of history. But this time, the road ahead was different. It was shorter. The end of the journey loomed in the distance, and he could see it clearly now. The heavyweight king had carved his legacy through a lifetime of discipline, an unwavering devotion to his craft. He had bested giants, dismantled legends, and walked away with the spoils of war draped over his shoulders. He had silenced the doubters, the critics, the ones who said he was too small, too unorthodox, too different. And now, as he wrapped his hands for yet another battle, the whispers of retirement grew louder. 2 more fights. That was the plan. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered toward the old mirror hanging in the corner. It was cracked at the edges, worn from time, much like the path he had walked. He stared at his own reflection, the scars of war etched across his face, the lines of experience deepening with each passing year. He was 38 now. The clock was ticking. The first step in his farewell march was clear. The unfinished business of the IBF heavyweight title needed to be settled. The winner of Daniel Dubois versus Joseph Parker would be next, and Usyk would be waiting, ready to claim what he believed was rightfully his. Another undisputed reign, another final conquest before stepping away from the battlefield. But it was the second fight that would shake the combat world to its core. A show fight. A clash between 2 warriors from different realms. Alex Pereira. The mere thought of it made Usyk chuckle under his breath, his hands tightening around the wraps. He had seen Pereira's rise, the destruction he left in his wake inside the octagon. The Brazilian carried a mystique, a presence that few possessed. His hands were heavy, his movement calculated, his hunger undeniable. And now, he wanted to cross into Usyk's world. A boxer versus a kickboxer turned MMA champion. A final spectacle before the curtain closed. Usyk knew the comparisons would come. They would talk about Mayweather and McGregor, about money fights and spectacle over skill. But this was different. This was not just business. This was personal. Pereira wanted this, and Usyk, despite his calm demeanor, was intrigued. The call-out had come through Rampage Jackson's podcast. Pereira's words had been measured, but the message was clear. He wanted to test himself against the best. He wanted Usyk. Inside the gym, the Ukrainian champion smirked. Fighters were always looking for the biggest mountain to climb, the greatest challenge to conquer. But stepping into the ring with him? That was a different world altogether. His trainer, standing near the ropes, folded his arms. You really considering it? Usyk unwrapped his hands slowly, his expression unreadable. Why not? His coach exhaled, rubbing his temples. Because it's madness. Pereira's good, but he's not a boxer. He's strong, but he doesn't have your skill set. This isn't like McGregor-Mayweather. This isn't just a money fight. This is a fight between 2 real champions. If he takes this fight seriously, he'll train like his life depends on it. Usyk nodded, his mind already racing ahead. That's what makes it interesting. The idea of it was electric. The purists would scoff, the analysts would debate, but Usyk didn't care for any of that. He had spent his life proving people wrong. He had walked through fire to claim his place at the top, and if Pereira wanted to step into the ring, he would be welcome to try. But first, there was business to take care of. Dubois or Parker, whoever emerged victorious, would be his next opponent. And Usyk would be waiting, ready to make history one last time. As he laced up his gloves again, he could feel the hunger still burning inside him. 2 more fights. That was the plan. But the fight world was unpredictable. And so was Usyk. The dawn crept over Kiev, casting long shadows through the towering buildings, illuminating streets worn by time and history. Oleksandr Usyk stood by the window of his apartment, gazing out at the city he had fought for, bled for, and carried on his back as he ascended the ranks of boxing royalty. The weight of legacy hung heavy on his shoulders, but it was a burden he had long since embraced. Retirement loomed on the horizon, closer now than ever before, but 2 fights still stood between him and the end of his journey. 2 final wars before he would walk away from the ring forever. He turned from the window and sat on the edge of his bed, his fingers absently tracing the rough calluses on his hands. They were hands forged by battle, hardened by years of striking leather, of breaking down men who had once been thought unbeatable. Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, Daniel Dubois, he had taken them all. And yet, the hunger inside him had not yet faded. The warrior's spirit still burned, demanding just a little more before he finally laid down his gloves. His phone vibrated on the nightstand, snapping him from his thoughts. A message from his manager, short and to the point: Parker vs. Dubois. February 22. Then we move. Usyk exhaled slowly. That fight was the first step. The winner of Joseph Parker and Daniel Dubois would be his next opponent, the final piece in his quest to once again unify the heavyweight division. He had beaten Dubois before, sending him crumbling to the canvas with a perfectly placed shot to the body. But Parker was different, crafty, experienced, a man who had survived the storm of the heavyweight division for years. Whoever emerged from that fight would be dangerous, hungry. But they would also be facing a man who had already conquered this battlefield. A man with nothing left to prove, only a legacy to seal. Yet, it wasn't just Parker or Dubois that filled his thoughts. It was Pereira. Alex Pereira. The Brazilian wrecking machine who had stormed through kickboxing, crossed into MMA, and captured the UFC light heavyweight championship in what seemed like the blink of an eye. A man with hands that carried the weight of destruction, who had left bodies in his wake with a precision that few could match. And now, he wanted to step into Usyk's world. Usyk smirked as he thought about it. Pereira was bold, fearless. He reminded Usyk of himself in a way, the willingness to step into new territory, to chase the biggest challenges without fear of failure. But stepping into a boxing ring was different. It wasn't like the octagon, where angles could be manipulated, where a well-timed kick or clinch could change the course of a fight. In the ring, it was only the hands that mattered. And against Usyk, that meant a level of skill and precision that Pereira had never encountered. But still, the idea of the fight excited him. His trainer's voice echoed in his head, from their conversation the night before. "You don't need this fight, Oleksandr. You've done everything. Pereira's dangerous, but he's not a boxer. If you lose, they'll say you ruined your legacy. If you win, they'll say it was expected." Usyk had simply smiled. "Then we give them something unexpected." There was something about the fight that called to him. It wasn't about money, though it would undoubtedly be a massive event. It wasn't even about proving himself, he had already done that time and time again. It was about something deeper. A warrior's farewell. Not just a quiet exit, but a battle that people would never forget. Something that would echo long after he was gone from the ring. Pereira had spoken about his desire to box, about wanting to test himself against the best. Usyk admired that. He had seen so many fighters play it safe, protecting their records, avoiding challenges that might risk their status. Pereira wasn't one of them. He was willing to walk into the lion's den. But Usyk was the lion. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His coach stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "They confirmed it," he said. "Pereira's team reached out. If we want the fight, it's hours after the Dubois-Parker winner." Usyk's eyes flickered with something unreadable excitement, perhaps, or maybe just the realization that this was really happening. He nodded once, standing up, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the weight of the moment. Good, he said simply. Then let's finish this the right way. His coach sighed. You know this fight is a risk, right? Pereira isn't like the others. Usyk smirked. Neither am I. The days passed quickly, the world turning its eyes to the upcoming Parker vs. Dubois showdown, speculation running wild about who would emerge victorious. But in the shadows, behind the press conferences and the headlines, Usyk was already preparing. Every morning, he laced up his gloves. Every night, he ran the roads of Kiev, his breath coming in steady bursts as his mind sharpened for what was to come. Pereira, on the other hand, had his own war to fight. Magomed Ankalaev loomed ahead of him at UFC 313, a brutal test that could end his reign before it even truly began. Usyk knew that if Pereira fell, the fight between them might disappear with him. The world wouldn't clamor for a boxing match if Pereira wasn't carrying gold. But Usyk had a feeling about him, a sense that Pereira wouldn't let himself fall so easily. The chessboard was set. The pieces were moving. And somewhere, in a different part of the world, Alex Pereira was likely thinking the same thing. Two men. Two warriors. Two final battles before the end. The road to Usyk's retirement had begun. The weight of the moment pressed down on the world of combat sports like an impending storm, thick with tension, heavy with anticipation. Across continents, fans debated, analysts speculated, and fighters themselves watched with a quiet, knowing gaze. The next chapter in Oleksandr Usyk's journey had already been written in whispers, but the ink had yet to dry. February 22 loomed, the night where the first piece of his retirement puzzle would fall into place. Dubois and Parker would stand across from each other in the ring, each man carrying his own ambitions, his own desperation to seize what Usyk had made his own. There was something different about this stage of a fighter's career where every fight felt more like an obligation than an opportunity, where time became an opponent just as dangerous as the man in front of you. But Usyk didn't see it that way. He had never been one to fear the ticking clock. He had been molded by war, by the grind of 1,000 hours spent in the shadows of empty gyms, perfecting every movement, every feint, every strike. And while the world turned its attention to the Dubois-Parker showdown, Usyk remained in his sanctuary. The gym smelled of sweat, leather, and the metallic tinge of blood long since washed away from the mats. His fists thudded against the heavy bag in a slow, deliberate rhythm, the echoes filling the space like the footsteps of a ghost. You don't watch the fights, do you? His coach asked from the corner, arms folded, his voice carrying the gruff edge of a man who had spent his life in the trenches of combat sports. Usyk finished his combination before turning, his expression unreadable. I already know what's going to happen, he said simply. The coach smirked. That's so? You got a prediction? Usyk tilted his head slightly, considering. Dubois is powerful, but Parker is patient. It'll go long. Parker by decision. His coach nodded, clearly already having thought the same thing. And if it's Dubois? Usyk shrugged. Then we do it again. It didn't matter to him, not really. He had beaten Dubois before. He had broken him, shattered the confidence he had walked in with that night. If Dubois won, Usyk would remind him of that feeling. If Parker won, Usyk would show him something he had never experienced before. The real question lingered unspoken between them. The one fight that wasn't just about belts, or legacy, or strategy. Pereira. The thought of it had embedded itself deep in Usyk's mind, and no amount of training could shake it. It wasn't the kind of fight he would normally take, not against an opponent so inexperienced in the art of boxing, not at this stage in his career. And yet, something about it felt right. Across the world, in a different kind of war zone, Alex Pereira was preparing for his own battle. UFC 313 was only weeks away, and Magomed Ankalaev stood in his path like a mountain that refused to be moved. The UFC light heavyweight champion wasn't just defending his belt, he was fighting for something bigger. He was fighting to keep the door open for the clash against Usyk. Pereira had made it clear. He wanted to box. He wanted the biggest test possible. And in Usyk he had found that test. But first, he had to survive Ankalaev. Usyk followed the headlines, the training footage, the whispers from the MMA world. Ankalaev was dangerous, relentless. A grappler by nature but a striker by necessity. If he got his hands on Pereira, it could be a long, grueling night for the Brazilian. If Pereira made a mistake, the fight could end before it ever truly began. Usyk had never stepped into a cage before, never fought under the bright lights of the UFC, but he understood the psychology of battle. He understood what it meant to fight with everything on the line. And that's what made this interesting. He knew how Pereira felt. He knew the weight of carrying expectations, the pressure of walking into an arena knowing millions were watching, waiting, ready to crown you or bury you depending on what happened in the next few rounds. That was why this fight had to happen. Because for all the talk, for all the differences between them, Usyk and Pereira weren't so different after all. Usyk wrapped his hands once more, the familiar routine bringing a sense of calm to his mind. "You think he wins?" his coach asked. It took Usyk a moment to answer. "Yes," he said finally. His coach studied him for a long moment. "And if he doesn't?" Usyk exhaled slowly. "Then I find another fight." The reality of combat sports was simple. Plans could be made, promises whispered, contracts even signed. But until two men stood across from each other, until the first punch was thrown, nothing was certain. If Pereira fell to Ankalaev, their fight might slip through the cracks. But if he won, then everything changed. Usyk turned back to the heavy bag, tightening his stance, rolling his shoulders. It didn't matter how it played out. He would be ready. And if Pereira survived the storm waiting for him at UFC 313, he would come face to face with a different kind of storm. A storm named Usyk. The days leading up to UFC 313 felt like the quiet before a storm, the kind of silence that stretched across the battlefield before steel met flesh and warriors fell in the name of something greater than themselves. Across the world, fighters sharpened their weapons in the darkness, but none carried the weight of expectation heavier than Alex Pereira. The Brazilian, a titan of violence in his own right, had spent years crafting a legacy that defied convention. A former two-division champion in glory kickboxing, a man who had walked into the UFC and carved through the competition with the precision of a blade through silk. He wasn't just another fighter, he was a force of nature. But on March 8, he wasn't fighting just to defend his belt. He was fighting for the right to step into a different kind of war. He was fighting for Usyk. Ankalaev was no ordinary opponent. He was the kind of fighter who thrived in chaos, a man who had weathered the storms of the division and emerged hardened by fire. His grappling was suffocating, his striking methodical, his patience unnerving. If Pereira made one mistake just when it could be over before it ever truly began. The odds weren't just stacked against him, they towered over him, daring him to defy them. Usyk watched from the shadows, eyes narrowed, expression unreadable. He had seen men break before, had watched champions fall under the weight of their own ambition. But there was something in Pereira's eyes, something that told him the Brazilian wasn't ready to surrender his destiny just yet. When the cage doors shut and the referee signaled for the war to begin, the world held its breath. The first round unfolded with an eerie kind of patience. Ankalaev, cautious but confident, tested the waters with feints and half-committed strikes, searching for the moment to drag Pereira into the depths. But Pereira wasn't there to play his game. He moved with the cold precision of a man who had seen this before, who had spent years navigating killers in the ring. Every step was measured, every strike thrown with purpose. Then, in the second round, the storm broke. Ankalev rushed forward, closing the distance with the kind of determination that left no room for doubt. His hands wrapped around Pereira's waist, muscles tensed, ready to rip him from the ground and impose his will. For a moment, the world seemed to slow, as if fate itself was holding its breath. And then, in a blur of motion, Pereira did the impossible. His knee shot up like a bullet from a gun, crashing into Ankalev's chin with a force that sent shockwaves through the arena. The Russian's body went stiff before crumbling to the mat, lifeless before he even hit the ground. The referee dove between them, waving off the fight, but the damage had already been done. The storm had passed. Pereira stood over his fallen opponent, chest rising and falling in steady breaths, his face unreadable. He had done what many believed was impossible. He had walked into the fire and emerged untouched. And more importantly, he had earned his place in the next battle. Somewhere, across the ocean, in the quiet solitude of a gym where legends were forged, Usyk allowed himself a rare smile. It was time. The call came within days. The negotiations, the contracts, the endless speculation from the media, all of it was noise, all of it irrelevant. There was only one truth that mattered. Oleksandr Usyk versus Alex Pereira. Boxing's finest against MMA's most terrifying striker. A battle that wasn't about titles or rankings, but about something far more primal. Respect. Legacy. Violence. The world watched as the two men stood face to face for the first time. Pereira, towering, arms folded across his chest, eyes burning with the quiet fire of a man who had already seen the worst the world had to offer. Usyk, calm, composed, carrying the weight of history on his shoulders with the ease of a man who had lived this moment 1,000 times before. No words were spoken. None were needed. The fight was set. And when the day came, when the arena swelled with the voices of thousands screaming their names, when the first bell rang and the gloves met in the center of the ring, the world finally understood why this fight had to happen. Because sometimes legends weren't made. They were forged in war.